So our Jim O'Shea is our next invited speaker, and I'm sure he's familiar to many of you. Jim O'Shea is professor of philosophy at University College Dublin. He's written extensively on the philosophy of Wilfrid Sellars, including this influential volume. Oh, you can't see it because he's sharing his screen. Whatever. Anyhow, Wilfrid Sellars' Naturalism with a Normative Turn, which many of you have probably read. He has also edited a volume, Sellars and His Legacy, for Oxford University Press. In addition to his work on Sellars, Jim has also done a lot of work on Kant, having published Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and Introduction and Interpretation in 2012. And more recently, he edited a volume, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a Critical Guide, for Cambridge University Press. And so we're all very pleased to welcome Jim as a speaker today. He's going to be presenting on Sellars' Kantian Naturalist Metaphysics of Morals. Take it away, Jim.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, Ronald, and everybody. And it's tough to follow that talk by Stephanie. It's about as clear as one can get. So there's no way I'm going to be that clear and right. But I do have an historical twist like Stephanie does, and it's mostly an historical paper. It doesn't have a lot of the nice extensions and criticisms of Sellars that's wonderful that we've been seeing from everybody. But we'll see. We'll see if there are any ideas in this that are useful. Is it coming up on the screen okay? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it looks great.
So P.F. Strawson in his, and let me know if this sounds okay and everything. P.F. Strawson in his 1985 book, Skepticism and Naturalism, Some Varieties, coined the idea of a liberal naturalism to describe the sorts of non-reductive, anti-skeptical, and anti-supernaturalist philosophical outlooks that he finds in Hume, in his Return to the Vulgar, in a slightly relaxed version of Kant, because Strawson went a little softer on what transcendental arguments could show, but they were still good, he thought, and the later Wittgenstein. So Strawson's liberal naturalism is a kind of anti-reductionism, anti-skepticism, anti-supernaturalist view of this kind. I use the phrase Kantian naturalism to narrow the discussion to philosophers such as Strawson, who have argued in different ways that Kant is particularly useful for developing certain formal or normativist insights that can be repurposed for use on both sides of the non-reductive and the naturalist sides of a liberal naturalism. Sellars himself notoriously pushed both the Kantian insights and a scientific version of naturalism about as hard or possibly harder than they can jointly be pushed. I regard the question as difficult both in itself and in relation to the interpretation of Sellars' views, but I'll have at it again today, this time in a historical spirit in relation to Sellars' developing views on the nature of the normative ought itself. Okay, so section 1. Okay. Now, oh, there we go. I'll do it. Section 1 is revisiting Sellars' conception of conceptual irreducibility with causal reducibility, the case of ought and is. So this was discussed by Zach wonderfully yesterday. In his early writings, most prominently in his 1953, A Semantic Solution to the Mind-Body Problem, Sellars, as we know, framed these issues in terms of a distinction between the logical or conceptual irreducibility of a given concept. He uses the phrase conceptual irreducibility later, and it's clear by logical he means in his thicker sense. Distinction between the conceptual irreducibility of a given concept as combinable in his view with the causal reducibility of that same concept. In relation to the causal reducibility or naturalization of ought, his main strategy here, as in his earlier 1949 paper, Language, Rules, and Behavior, LRB, is to sketch the barest outlines of a possible scientific psychology of rule-governed behavior. More specifically, he envisions an empirical but mentalistic psychology that would explain our behavior as being what it is because of the agent's conception or thought of rules as what causes or motivates their behavior, as what literally moves them or would move them to act in the ways they conceive. That is, in the language exit or world to fit mind direction of fit. The naturalizing idea in this context seems to be that the term or concept ought or obligation itself would occur, quote, in a properly constructed causal explanation only as a subordinate element in a descriptive mentalistic context, as entails occurs in Jones believes that A entails B. Obvious objections will spring to mind, but some of these Sellars addresses, so let's give the view a chance to grow. He continues in this way. After this, by the way, I'll say this in a moment, he deals with mental aboutness and means he treats subsequently. So he analyzes ought in terms of a mentalistic context, but then he deals with the mind-body problem next. So he continues, thus a non-naturalist who holds, as Sellars himself does, it becomes clear, that the only way in which moral obligation can enter the causal explanation of human history is via facts of the form Jones thinks or feels that he ought to pay his debt. That sort of non-naturalist would be holding that ought is, in the above sense, causally reducible as well to is. In traditional terminology, he would be claiming that obligation enters the causal order only as an element in the intentional object of a mental act. In the rest of SSMB, the semantic solution paper, Sellars' strategy is then to argue for a parallel account in turn of how thoughts themselves have intentional content or meaning. The proposal, as he puts it there, is that the pragmatic features of the use of statements about meaning or intentionality, where such use is the manifestation of habits that are generically identical across languages, do not assert but do convey the information about our resulting habits and patterns of linguistic response and inference. And Zach laid out some of this nicely. The idea is that the conveyed information about patterns of linguistic behavior could then in principle be asserted, that is described naturalistically in an ideal scientific account of such semantical habits and uniformities. Nonetheless, on the conceptually or pragmatically irreducible side of the story, it's clear that Sellars in SSMB is not asserting a simple equivalence between the relevant pragmatic features of use among speakers on the one hand, and the resulting describable habits of use that correspond to them on the other, but rather a mutual dependence between the two. That is, the patterns wouldn't be what they are, the uniformities without the practices, but also vice versa. The practices presuppose that the relevant uniformities are in place. Thus, so on the one hand, statements that X means or is about such and such will presuppose the relevant corresponding causal patterns and habits of verbal behavior. Thus, causal laws stated in terms of aboutness and hence causal laws formulated in mentalistic terms, he says, presuppose causal laws which are not stated in terms of aboutness, unquote. But on the other hand, he stresses that, quote, it's only because, one back there, but it's only because people correctly use semantical statements. To convey what is in principle mentioned by non-semantical statements, unquote, that it's correct to make the causal statements that relate intentional ascriptions to the causal patterns or behavioral patterns they both generate and presuppose. So it's our rule-governed espousal of principles that one ought to do or use terms in a certain way, that generates uniformities of linguistic behavior. And those uniformities are what they are because of the norm-governed espousal of principles. But the norm-governed espousal of principles, too, depends on or presupposes that responses to the objects are in certain patterns and inferential habits are in certain patterns, and so on. So Sellars then ties this back. So to make correct use of semantical statements is to think about aboutness. And this ties it back to his parallel account of ought. He says there is a sense in which about enters the causal order only by virtue of the fact that people think about aboutness, that is only by facts of the form. Jones thinks that X is about Y, and in this case resembles ought. What this last remark makes clear is that Sellars' way of addressing the natural causal reducibility, yet conceptual irreducibility of intentional states, that's the mind-body problem, involves the same sort of move that he gestured at in relation to the normative ought in general, when he appealed to, quote, facts of the form Jones thinks or feels that he ought to pay his debt. As Sellars concludes at the end of SSMB, quote, it will be noticed that if one combines our assertion of the causal reducibility of ought to is with our account of mentalistic discourse, the ethical naturalism gets everything he can reasonably hope for. Yet the fact remains that what is said by Jones ought to pay his debt could not be said even in an ideal PMEs, that is, even in the ideal extensionalist logic of Principia Mathematica. But what's really involved in Sellars' move to Jones thinking about Jones is thinking about obligation or about aboutness, conceived as making possible the causal reducibility or naturalizing side of his overall picture. It's one thing for Sellars to claim to have avoided the sorts of metaphysical conceptions of causal irreducibility represented by his explicit targets in SSMB, such as Cartesian dualism or Pritchard and Ross's non-naturalist intuitionism. But it must strike us as quite another, so you can avoid those metaphysical relational conceptions, but it must strike us as quite another thing to claim to have thereby naturalistically causally reduced the normative or the intentional in general, even given that this is supposed to be held conjointly with recognizing the dimension of normative pragmatic irreducibility. For example, Robert Brandom holds that normative properties, I'm sure he'd be happy to say that normative properties, quote, enter the causal order, in Sellars' phrase, only in virtue of our attitudes of taking to be committed or entitled, that, quote, we have met the norms and they are ours. But he stresses that it's norms all the way down as far as the explanation of human thought and action are concerned. In SSMB, Sellars doesn't really say much about how he envisions a causal reduction of the concept of obligation by an explanatory appeal to our thoughts about obligation. He does, however, refer to the reader back to his account that he had published in his 1952 revised article on obligation and motivation. So that's there. So I want to take a look at Sellars' 1952 account of obligation and motivation, which is where he sketches the account of the causal reducibility and conceptual irreducibility of the ought that he very lightly sketches in the semantic solution paper. So one thing that's clear in this paper is, again, that Sellars wants to avoid the metaphysical placement problems in Hugh Price's sense that would result from analyzing Jones's thought, I want to do X or I ought to do X, as, quote, asserting an ultimate and unanalyzable relation of want or of obligation between myself and the doing of X by me. Sellars' analysis of both want to do and ought to do reveals the surface relational grammar to be misleading, in that Y wants to do X isn't like Y eats an apple, as he says, ARB, but more like, quote, Y finds the thought of doing X attractive, combined with Y's thought of doing X tends to evoke the doing of X, unquote. Similarly, in his analysis of Y ought to do A and C, I'll leave out the in circumstances just for brevity. In both cases, Sellars explains the mental tokenings of the relevant thoughts tend to motivate or move one to the doing of A. However, the difference is that in wanting to do X, it is the thought of oneself doing X which tends to evoke the doing of X, whereas, quote, when I truly say I ought to do X, it is the thought of myself doing X as an instance of everybody doing X, which tends to evoke the doing of X. And in those quotes, I've left out the in circumstances C, as Sellars himself does in that article a bit. So, but in the revised second half of that article, he published it in 1951 and then 1952. He picked it for the Sellars and Hosper's famous volume on readings in ethical theory, and he added a whole second half to it. And there Sellars clarifies that the thought that motivates us in our ordinary moral consciousness is indeed the thought that everyone ought to do A, not just the thought that everyone does A. But he stresses that while in this way, quote, the language of norms is a mode of discourse which presupposes but is irreducible to the language of fact, normative statements would be empty husks, albeit with a unique or sui generis, he says, logical grammar, were it not that we are also acquiring tendencies to be moved to act by the thought tokenings in which the term ought appears. And it is this latter motivational role that explains, quote, how the language game of norms gains application in the world. So I ought to do A statements or thoughts are thus, quote, normally the expression, he says, of a motivational tendency, but also in another sense, which is revealed only in the deep structure, functional analysis, as it were, I ought to do X, quote, is also a mention of the ought thought as motivating in this way, or as he puts it, as feeling obligated. It's complicated because in that article, Sellars distinguishes three senses of analysis. And the third sense introduces new terms and basically introduces, it's kind of like redefinition. It introduces elements that are not just analyzing the materials of use that are already there. He compares it to analyzing objects, ordinary objects in terms of micro entities. So he's calling it all analysis, but it's partly explanation in his sense. So he concludes, ought is capable of analysis in descriptive terms and is an analyzable concept of empirical psychology. Again, it's not that we ordinarily think of our obligations in this thought mentioning way. The idea is that this is what's really going on, that that's the explanation of how it works. This bears some similarity, I think, similarity to Hugh Price's two-leveled analysis, not the E representation stuff that's like picturing. Price has two levels where he has the normative inferentialist use of a given concept, and he has the underlying pragmatic function of that concept in our lives. And in his subject naturalism, that distinction is important. And I think there's something like that arguably going on here in Sellars. Sellars concludes that, quote, I ought to do X is capable of analysis in descriptive terms along the lines we have suggested. And as I've said, is an analyzable concept of empirical psychology. And Price uses anthropology in an arguably similar way in his subject naturalism. So Sellars puts his overall conclusion this way. If the main contention of this paper is sound, we can run with the naturalists that psychology of feeling obligated can be developed in purely descriptive terms, while hunting with the intuitionists, in a perfectly legitimate sense, the concept of obligation is ultimate and irreducible. Now, so we can perhaps see why in the semantic solution paper, Sellars refers us back to this obligation and motivation paper as attempting to sketch in a bit more detail the conceptual irreducibility yet causal reducibility of ought to is, which was his sought for middle way between emotivism and intuitionism. Subsequently, in his 1956 article on imperatives, intentions, and the logic of ought, and its substantial revision in 1963, many of the familiar innovations in terms of we shall intentions are developed, and Stephanie's gone over this nicely. As the 1960s progressed, perhaps in part because Kant had finally begun to clean up his act in the eyes of Sellars' analytic colleagues, he would now reframe his sought-for middle way in terms of a combination of teleological and deontological themes. He explains this in terms of a we intention motivated concern for the well-being of every one of us as a community. This is conceptualized in terms of categorical principles of duty that are in one sense directly intended for their own sake, acting on principle from a sense of duty, but at bottom because the following of which would serve to promote the wider intended end of human welfare in general. I guess it's one big, I don't know what people think about this, but one important difference from Kant's ethics is that Kant's highest good incorporates human happiness as an end only as proportion to a prior pure categorical conception of one's moral worthiness to be happy. So I'm not sure that Sellars' way of embedding duty for its own sake within and aiming at a conceptually prior concern for the community's welfare really does result in, quote, a thoroughly Kantian metaphysics of morals. He would probably just say that Kant's more pure attempt to ground categorical imperative is a non-runner. But anyway, that's just a question. I want to turn now to some of these familiar challenges to Sellars' causal reducibility conception. But first, what notion of the causal reducibility or naturalistic explanation of the concept of ought is supposed to emerge from these early articles? Something seem clear. It's not directly explicated in terms of the idea that in principle we could use particle physics to predict the redistributions of particles that are occurring in roughly the same region of space where Smith has tokened the thought that she ought to pay her student loans. But I mean, this isn't to say that Zach's analysis isn't to the point, because ultimately you get down to that. So I want to say a few things about that. But the proximate causal reducibility of ought is in terms of this empirical psychology of motivation in terms of thought about ought. Rather, the causal reduction has to do proximately with a possible empirical psychological account of the conceptualized thoughts and feelings about ought that motivate or tend to evoke, and in several senses are expressed in corresponding patterns of behavior. Also clear is that the analysis is intended to be semantically deflationary in a way designed to avoid reference to any non-natural metaphysical relations or properties of obligation. Perhaps also, as Sellars suggests, the account would not require the asserting or using, as opposed to the explanatory mentioning, of any ethical claims or concepts in the explanation of their causal motivational roles. Furthermore, the account offers a picture of morality on which it has to do primarily with willed action, with universalized exit volitions, and thus with transforming or having transformed the world rather than describing or explaining in Sellars' sense. However, the conceptual irreducibility side of the story entails that the prescribed or intended patterns of behavior, for example, that no one of us misleads people in circumstances C, are generally not going to be extensionally equivalent to the actual patterns or uniformities of behavior that emerge. This is why Sellars concludes SSMB by saying, quote, "We have rejected the extensionalist thesis with respect to both ought and about." Or again, as Sellars puts the point elsewhere, the presupposed core generalizations of prescribed rules, whether moral, intentional, or semantic, are in the nature of the case violated in this way. As he says in LRB, Language Rules Behavior, quote, "A rule is an embodied generalization that tends to make itself true, or better," he continues, "it tends to exhibit the occurrence of such events as would falsify it, if it weren't already false. That is, for the generalizations which lie at the core of rules are rarely, if ever, true, and unless they could be false, they could scarcely function as rules," unquote. It's one thing to rely, as Sellars does in his Truth and Correspondence article, TC, that 1960, I think, or 62, on the norm nature. It's one thing to rely on the norm nature meta principle, this is what I emphasized, that, quote, "Our espousal of principles is reflected in naturalistically describable uniformities of performance." It's one thing to rely on that principle in a way that might be sufficient to support Sellars' naturalistic theory of a picturing correspondence to the world. As far as the resulting natural linguistic patterns are concerned, that's the use he makes of it in Truth and Correspondence. But to claim thereby to have naturalistically reduced the normativity of the ought principles themselves, or to have causally reduced what is involved in the espousal of such principles, I think is a different matter. Perhaps the reductive naturalist could reply on Sellars' behalf that the ideal empirical psychology he envisions would in principle be able to explain each of the divergences of the actual behavioral upshots from the prescribed norms. But the ways in which we know how to look for explanations of this kind, explaining why things break down, the ways in which we look for those kinds of explanations are always reliant or indirectly parasitic on the same wider web of normative conceptions as the normative principle in question. To borrow Zach DeVore's nice term, the, quote, "causal footprints," unquote, left at the lower levels don't reductively explain the adaptive, intentional, or prescribed walking causes at the higher levels in terms of their own higher level salient kinds and laws. From those perspectives, the multiply realizing lower level patterns are many and gerrymandered. These are familiar issues raised variously across the spectrum from Fodor to the left-wing Sellarsians, and Jeremy raises them very well in his book on Sellars' ethics. And they raise non-trivial problems for the idea of a causal reduction or naturalization of normativity. Other more indirect causal reductionist responses are available to address this sort of challenge. I mean, very directly available right now with Zach and Preston and others. But for my immediate purposes, I just want to evoke the general worry, and I'll return to it in the next section. So perhaps what most current readers take away from Sellars' early and middle analyses of ought and motivation is the important point that perennially attempting non-naturalist, realist conceptions of the moral lot, with intuition being just one example, are confronted with a groundbreaking alternative, groundbreaking in the sense that a lot of these notions Sellars is developing weren't developed in the way he's developing. An alternative in Sellars' normatively pragmatic, expressivist, and metaphysically deflationary account of how our intersubjective conceptions or thoughts about obligation and about what's about what motivate and thus cause our behavior. But the idea that what has thereby been sketched is a non-trivial causal reduction of the normative ought to the scientific empirical seems a way of putting the actual upshot of those analyses. And as Sellars' career developed from the 1950s through the 60s, he retained and further developed the core of the above account of moral motivation in terms of a motivated concern for others' welfare, expressed by means of conceptually universalized intersubjective thoughts. But this outlook gradually becomes situated within an increased focus on freedom, motivation, and decision-making from a Kantian point of view, significantly reframing the issues we've been looking at. I'll broach this issue in section 4 with some remarks on Sellars' very different way of framing the issues in his 1962 Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, the Human Being, PSIM. So I turn to some remarks on scientific image naturalism and manifest image persons. But first, on the naturalizing side of things, I want to look at part 4 of PSIM, entitled The Scientific Image. Put in terms of the familiar metaphor of higher and lower levels of nature, this section considers scientific reducibility issues across all the levels of nature in the wider context of evolutionary theory, stepping down from what he calls human behavioristics to earthworm or animal behavioristics through medicine, neurophysiology, biochemistry, physical chemistry, and subatomic physics. Sellars' bluntly stated conclusion in that section is that, quote, the scientific image of man, the human being, turns out to be that of a complex physical system, unquote. I noted earlier that naturalism has been given stronger and weaker readings by liberal naturalists. In PSIM 4, it can appear to be that can appear to be a trivial token identity or merely compositional anti-supernaturalism, where Sellars says we can identify chemical objects with physical objects and so on, with methodologically helpful but strictly falsified laws at the higher levels, plus norms. Atoms in the void plus Geist, as Tom Breed recently memorably put it. In PSIM, I think Sellars attempts to sketch a middle way naturalism that envisions reductively redefining and identifying chemical objects with systems of subatomic particles, for example, but while also emphasizing that the principles, laws, and methods of the higher sciences, and so those sciences themselves, remain predictably efficacious at their own conceptualized levels. But that view of Sellars, in turn, and that's what I just read there, that view in turn is capable of weaker and stronger interpretations. I suspect that in PSIM 4, and this is what I spent a long time thinking about this, preparing for this paper months ago, and I'm only end up using a little bit of it, but it's interesting to me. I think what Sellars does is set some very substantive requirements against the background of evolutionary theory on what it would take for a lower level science actually to succeed in reductively explaining the functionally conceived phenomena of the next levels up as conceived in their own quasi-normative or proper functional terms. I have
about 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. I have in mind Sellars' remarks. And let's see if I got that here next. Yeah, I have in mind Sellars' remarks such as, quote, the scientific explanation of human behavior and also animal behavioristics, earthworm behavioristics, must take into account those cases where the correlations characteristic of the organism in normal circumstances break down, unquote, and the role of the next lower level science in targeting and explaining and thus saving both the normality and the breakdown phenomena in their own terms, but reconceiving those terms. The idea would be that what Sellars has in mind is a synchronic levels of nature analog of his sophisticated save the predecessor phenomena account of diachronics, scientific theory replacement, and conceptual change. Possibly this might help Sellars to respond to certain robust anti-reductionist salience arguments against causal reducibility that I mentioned. So the idea is, I don't want to digress too much on it, but in Einstein targets Newton's conceptions of mass, acceleration, and the like. Einstein remodels them in Einstein's own relativistic terms, but is redefining the Newtonian conceptions in a specific way that targets them as the phenomena they are, and is able to explain the successes and the breakdowns of the Newtonian framework. So the idea is that Sellars is looking for substantive linkages up the levels and down the levels like that in synchronically as well. Now, whether that works or not, certainly I think Sellars' own blunt statements that science pictures humans as just bundles of micro processes can be seriously misleading ways of summing up his own requirements on phenomena-saving scientific explanation. But however sympathetically one might read Sellars' levels naturalism, like it returning to his father, as it were, in the final part 7 of PSIN, Sellars explicitly considers and rejects the idea that, quote, the categories of the person might, in an analogous way to how biochemistry relates to physics and so on, be reconstructed without loss in terms in terms of the fundamental concepts of the scientific image. Now, there's an interesting first non-step in the way that Sellars does this. I think I'm going to flick ahead like this and then just read down to make sure I don't bother always looking for when I should click here. There's this interesting first non-step in the way that Sellars rejects that idea, and it's easily overlooked. For what he first says is that he doesn't have in mind the free will objection to such a proposed scientific reconstruction of persons. On this, he refers the reader back to the broadly compatibilist conceptual distinctions he had made earlier in PSIM during his account of the manifest image, where he had distinguished between the concept of a person's responsible character in relation to our manifest conceptions of real circumstances of choice and its ordinary manifest prevention or disabling. And there's a nice interventionist conception of causality that he has. He already had it in the 60s of what causality means in the relevant sense in the manifest image. This he opposes to the misapplied ideal scientific determinist conception of entire cross-sections of the universe's past, mistakenly conceived as the pseudo-circumstance in which all our behaviors find their scientifically lawful explanation. I'll pop these up too. Okay. Interestingly, he suggests that the could have done otherwise concepts that are essential to the categories of personhood could in this respect be reconstructed, quote, as extraordinarily complex defined concepts, unquote. He says that what's really decisive against such a complex scientific reconstruction isn't free will, but is the logical point that, quote, the irreducibility of the personal is the irreducibility of the ought to the is.
About 5 minutes.
Okay. And he goes on to sketch his conception of, quote, the language of community and individual intentions, pointing out that, quote, to think thoughts of this kind is not to classify or to explain, but to rehearse an intention. So in the end, while he suggests that the objects of our intentional actions could be ideally conceived in Feyerabindian scientific terms, though with available recourse to explanations in higher level patterns too, as I explained, quote, the irreducibility of the we, unquote, and of our action-oriented thoughts in terms of ought remain conceptually unreduced in all their crucial norm instituting, artifact creating, and personhood sustaining roles. So in building on this logical point during the 1960s, however, I think Sellars deepened his conception of freedom in two ways that perhaps strengthen the anti-reductionist or liberal side of his liberal scientific naturalism. Okay, so I got section 5 here, and I'll just read through the overhead here, pointing out some key points. But in his 1966 Fatalism and Determinism, he filled out that compatibilism. Now, my idea, I don't know, I'm not an expert on Strawson's Freedom and Resentment by any means. I only reread it very recently. But the key move in Sellars' view of compatibilist freedom strikes me as similar in its key move to Strawson's very different subtle position on our intersubjective participant reactive attitudes in Freedom and Resentment. Because the similar upshot of both of those is that a principle of scientific determinism, assuming that's fine, could not be coherently engaged in explaining human behavior while also maintaining, as we practically must, Strawson argues, our manifest image intersubjective normative categories and participant reactive attitudes of moral responsibility and excusability. So the universal scientific determinism, it's fine, but it doesn't engage with the set of circumstances concerning real circumstances of accountability, blame, disability, and so on. And I think a similar distinction has to apply to Sellars' easy solution to how thoughts integrate into the scientific order, that just through multiple realizability, which was a revolutionary idea when he's doing it, but similarly his is a normative function. So the decisive issue is going to be the normativity of those functional roles. So finally, I think intermotivational conflicts became a greater focus of Sellars during the 1960s and in his Kantian period. And he does it in a wonderful way in Knowing the Better and Doing the Worse in 1969-70, which brings back the reasons internalism, which he had from the beginning. And I just want to take, you can just see the picture of this. He does it very clearly, although it can mislead in certain ways. He cites, he's looking at Socrates, that virtue is knowledge. And he cites David Falk, who Sellars knew well. Apparently, when Falk was he died when I was a graduate student at Chapel Hill, and I was deeply into his stuff. But anyway, apparently Sellars, when he was head of department at Chapel Hill, called up Sellars and said, "Who should I hire?" This was the old boy network in those days. And Sellars said, "That's this guy Rosenberg. You should hire him." So he knew Falk well, but he refers all the way back now in 1970 to his ought and motivation. And Sellars defends an internalist view of reasons. If a person knows that he ought to do A, then he ipso facto has a reason to do A. That's the weaker version that he starts with, Sellars. And he responds to Frankena's objection that the internalist confuses motivation and justification in this way. And Sellars kind of nicely, I think, I'm not an expert on meta-ethics of these sorts of things, but Sellars says the reasons all are intrinsically internally motivating, but there are good reasons or motives conclusively good reasons or motives, and conclusively powerful or prevailing reasons or motives. So Plato's insight was to try to link what one ought to do with what one would be moved to do, all things to consider, and to link that to the welfare of the city. But Plato's mistake was to conclude in saying that knowledge is virtue in the way that he does, is to say that a conclusively good reason is necessarily a conclusively prevailing reason or motive. And he's also seeking the welfare of the community in terms of rational self-love, which Sellars rejects. So Sellars sketches his view of the interpersonal, quote, mode of motivation, but such that even after all things have been considered, and I'm coming to the end here, as they really are, even after that, there would be two coherent motives, quote, the welfare of our community viewed as related to the actions of each of us, interpersonal benevolence, and one's own happiness or well-being viewed from a personal point of view as one's own happiness or well-being, as one's own happiness, self-love or rational self-interest. And he says these overarching motives, perhaps this relates to Stephanie's paper in a way, are incommensurable and not only capable of conflict, but typically conflicting, but though not always in Sartrean dramatic degrees. And they're often nicely overlapping in the way Bishop Butler suggests, and Sellars suggests on how really intelligent love, self-love, can support, but it ultimately depends on concern for others. But the typically conflicting, good-reasoned, well-reasoned motivations of self-love versus those of morality remain at the heart of the human condition for Sellars, right down to the bottom, not a foundational bottom, but as the human condition. So he does his bit where he adds the conceptual truth that to think of oneself as a member of a community with a shared motivation that entails promoting the community welfare, entails that the moral reason or motive is a conclusively good reason. He grants that. But such a reason isn't conclusively prevailing over the perfectly good reasons of rational self-love. And so he ends his article with this: at the moment of decision, one or the other of these candidates for an orientation of the self in action, each in its own way overarching, predominates. The choice is in an important sense between incommensurables. Which choice one makes is a revelation of what one at that moment is. It's often surprising, sometimes exhilarating or disconcerting, even devastating, but always a revelation. And I end there. And so we can know the better and do the worse for Sellars, not just by acting out of impulse or through weakness of wills, but through all things having been considered for what they are, these two motives of morality and of rational self-love. It comes down to what Kant called Willkür, rather than Wille, which gives you the moral will, between the reason motive of morality and the reason motives from a personal point of view. And I think that's rock bottom, not foundationally rock bottom, but it's what Sellars leaves us with. And which way you go is a measure of what you are at that moment are. But returning to liberal naturalism and causal reduction, we can say in a naturalistic spirit, like everyone wants to, that how thoughts motivate our behavior, there's nothing naturalistically mysterious about it. And so how competing motives compete and how one does prevail, we can say that there's nothing naturalistically mysterious about it. But although this inner conflict is built out of Strawsonian manifest image materials, I think that it adds a variability, an inscrutable practical inscrutability and variability about how our motivated espousal of normative principles are imperfectly reflected in the crooked timber of our resulting naturalistically describable uniformities of behavior. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Trying to unshare myself here. There we go.
All right. Thank you, Jim, for a great talk. And the floor is now open for questions for the next 20 minutes or so. So well, I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. So and then Preston, sorry, Preston, you were just a little bit late there. I'm still going to exercise chair's prerogative. You're talking about Sellars naturalism and talking about what I take to be and what I guess you take to be the failure of the causal reducibility thesis. I mean, this is maybe too big of a question, but so what?
Okay, it's too big of a paper.
I guess the worry that a Sellarsian is going to be left with after the failure of the causal reducibility thesis is what kind of shape does the Sellarsian naturalism take after that? Because of course, I guess I take it if you're sort of an orthodox Sellarsian, that's sort of a linchpin of his naturalism. I mean, that seems to be a pretty central piece of fitting persons within the scientific worldview. But as you know, I find it to be a totally implausible piece of the puzzle. But once you get rid of that, how do the pieces of the puzzle fit together now exactly into the stereoscopic vision?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, I think one of the points that comes out is a lot of naturalistic things come out of the early analyses that maybe aren't best put in terms of reducibility. So it's all the anti-metaphysical deflationary points, the point about naturalistic sources of motivation, the denial of placement problems through deflating certain things. And, the way he wants to put that is in terms of causal reducibility. But I think by philosophy and the scientific image of man, he's come to see that he shouldn't state it in the way that is going to be taken to be perfectly analogous to the way he deals with reducibility in the other dimensions. So he explains the sort of model, and I think it's a rich notion of, you could call it causal reducibility, all the way up the levels of nature. But I think he's come to see that those expressivist points that he was making earlier don't need to be put in terms of having been causally reduced when we say that they're in the business of prescribing and transforming the world and require no metaphysics of how they do so in order to do what they do. So I think he's enriched his picture. He's kept many of the same materials, but the idea that a causal reduction of the same point that he's sketching among the levels of nature in general is the way to put the sort of liberal naturalism that integrates with science. It's misleading to put it that way.
Thank you. That's actually helpful. Thank you. Preston?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So Jim, I want to ask you about how you see Brandam's project in this context. Because one way of understanding what Brandam is doing in making it explicit with the distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes is to try to give a kind of causal reduction of the sort that you're outlining Sellars here. And I guess I'm curious from your standpoint, since you've got a pretty developed view on what you take to be the merits and flaws of Sellars' own approach. Do you feel that Brandam's effort in that regard is any better, that grounding normative statuses, or at least our responses to normative statuses in our attitudes is
So
plausible, or I mean, he doesn't go into the detail that Sellars does, but do you feel like it's got some life to it?
yeah, I think that's I think it's very similar. And so it's not that I thought you were going to push the naturalist picture story a little bit more by, once you get to, I think Sellars is looking at how we institute and express norms in terms of our attitudes, and then how these, this business about asserting and conveying or presupposing naturalistic uniformities. That's very much in Brandam, done in a more systematic way than Sellars, with the pragmatic meta-languages. I mean, you're really good on this, and how they are related to the pragmatic meta-languages and how they relate to first-order discourse. So I see Sellars and Brandam as very tightly linked in that way. The thing is that then Brandam, with the norms all the way down, as it were, he cites Millikan and Hugh Price in very nice ways, and says there's this other project of trying to give a naturalistic account of how we get into this game. And this isn't to mention the picturing stuff, which is important too, because I think that can be embedded within a Brandomian normativist and Sellarsian sort of account, and within McDowell's account for that matter, as long as it's constrained and regulated by norms. But when he thinks about Price's subject naturalism, which again I mentioned a few times, bears a lot of similarities to what I think Sellars is doing, he gets off the boat. And I don't know whether that's because, I mean, I think Price would say too, it's not like when you give a functional account in naturalistic terms of what's going on when people are expressively, normatively doing the things they do, it's not like you're going to be able to dispense with that upper level. And so I think Brandam could be more ambitiously on the naturalistic side without abandoning the Janus, the thing always. That's where I'm. But this is what I think Sellars holds, is that it's always going to be Janus faced, and you're never going to, as it were, reduce to the non-normative. But I think Sellars clearly envisions, and like you've been working on, an evolution. He says there'd be an evolutionary account, a causal account, and in MGEC he says this, of the evolution of conceptual thinking. I think a lot of interesting things could be done to try to fill it, is that added to be able to institute norms. But the basic move by Brandam, his normative phenomenalism, does he call it? I can't remember, the taking to be. I think there's a similar move in Sellars, yeah. Does that
Great. Stephanie?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I just have a question about a detail, but a detail which kept puzzling me like for some time, and you're the best person to ask that question. And if you do not have any thoughts on that, then just ignore my question. But Sellars says that, for example, meaning statements, they say something like that Hund in German means dog, yeah, but they convey some further information, for example, about the uniformities of the behavior of German speakers and so forth. But and he often uses this word convey, and people when they write about Sellars on that causal reducibility thesis, then they just tend to just also use that word, convey.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what precisely does that mean, and what's the precise relationship between what is said here, that Hund means dog, for example, and the information that is conveyed? Is that, say, an implication? Or because in today's pragmatics, you would say, okay, convey is like when I have irony, then I say something, but I convey, say, the contrary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this
That would be
this sense, or I'm just puzzled about that, and maybe you have some thoughts about it.
and that would be probably a more intentional sense of convey that you're using. Am I echoing against myself? Is that okay? It's fine anyway. You use irony intentionally to convey the opposite of the thing that you're saying. Was that I agree that this has to be. This is one of the things I think Brandom spells out well. I think it's exactly that he thinks is spelled out about how what we say relates to what we have to do and so on. But I think it's a presuppositional notion. It's not an intentional intending to convey by means of doing something. So what's the nice example is that just say if you see a red apple, you're clearly not saying anything about or if you say that Jones sees that there's a red apple, you're not saying anything about Jones as being causally affected by the red apple, that there being a reliability relation between Jones's statements, I see a red apple, and there being a red apple, and so on. So the perceptual statement conveys a lot of information about what has to be in place in the naturalistic relations involved, but doesn't say anything about those relations. So I'm thinking of the exact sort of case, the thing that Sellars has in mind in relation to perception in this regard. But his broader notion is if you say that Hund means dog, you're not saying that the patterns of inference from one assertion to another and the responses to dogs involving there's a dog, you're not saying all these things that he's going to call semantic uniformities when you assert a meaning claim, but the meaning claim conveys that Hund is doing the same thing that dog does for me, and when that carries or conveys a lot of information about the sorts of things you'd know how to do with Hund without necessarily saying that. So, I mean, presupposes I think it's a presuppositional notion.
Yeah, I will take up this suggestion and think about it further, whether that makes sense. Yeah, in a, say, standard notion of presupposition, whether yeah.
I don't know if it relates to Sellars' article on presupp.
He has one on presupposing. Yeah, that would be a good idea to have a look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I looked at that once. I don't know whether it. But the general idea is that semantic rules, the espousal of those sort of normative guidances and rules that one ought to say dog in response to this sort of animal and not that sort of animal. We carry on our lives in the normative ambiance of all these ought to be's about how to use language. What we don't talk about is that establishes uniformities, that the children start responding regularly and reliably only to dogs when they say dog and no longer to other animals, other similar animals, and so on. So the normative uses of and there's analogous things then with, I see the book as presupposing that I'm related in certain ways to the book, that there is a book and that the book has caused me to have this experience and so on. Unless those were in place, you wouldn't be a person that's able to see a red apple or to know that there is a red apple. So in semantics or in epistemology, all of these normative ought to be's that we learn in growing up in the language game go along with regularities or uniformities of response and of inference and of action. And so we don't mention those, but the normative activities both generate those and depend on those to be what they are, for perceptual knowledge to be what it is, for Hund to mean dog in the way that it does.
Since we only have a few minutes, maybe we could move on to Bill as the last hand that I see.
I was struck by one of the points you made in one of the slides that implied that if no one ever thinks about aboutness, there is no such thing. And that strikes me as wildly implausible. I mean, even if humans had never evolved into linguistic creatures that had a concept of aboutness and could therefore think about aboutness, it still would have been the case that there were ways to explain animal behavior.
Sure.
Not that anyone would have been doing that if there were no linguistic creatures around, but the ways to explain animal behavior still should have, would have, whatever, adverted to the aboutness of animal thoughts, right? Because animals think about food and about mates and about predators and safety and things like that. So that just struck me as an implication. If Wilfred really does believe that there is aboutness only if people are capable of thinking about aboutness, whew, that just strikes me as just wrong.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, what I'm going to go on to say is that absolutely, I think he's got this view of there are two kinds of anything being about anything, right? Of anything representing anything. It only becomes clear in the Mental Events article, 1981. For anything to represent or be about anything, it has to be embedded within some wider system that basically establishes a kind of proper functioning or a rule governedness of a normativity of two kinds. One's a logical space of reasons, and that's what he's talking about when he's talking about humans thinking about aboutness. And the other kind is the sort of proper functioning that natural selection generates and so on. So, and I think he thinks, and I think all this is a fascinating part of his view that he didn't get to developing until later, when he read a ton of, in the late 60s and 70s, he read a ton of stuff about animal representation, such as it was, and so on. So he says there's no problem with an innate representation of something as something, and that all has to do with the story about animal representation. And I think a lot of that is exploited by us, of course, in the ways that we recognize faces. But even once we grow into a logical space of reasons, I think we're always moving about the world in a way that relies upon our animal heritage. But then it would be an interesting question. It's an interesting question how he draws that line, and then Preston would do a much better job than I would on those sorts of questions. He goes for logical representational systems, beings with logical operators in their repertoire versus animal.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again, Jim, for that talk, and thank you again for the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you all.